There are emergency calls that end with sirens arriving just in time. Others become the first chapter of a solved murder. Then there are the rare calls that haunt investigators for years. In the early hours of May 1st, 2010, a 24-year-old woman called 911, saying someone was trying to kill her. Before help arrived, she disappeared without a trace. Shannan Gilbert's story holds a unique place in American true crime. Her disappearance remains controversial, not only because her death has never been fully explained, but because the search for her led investigators to the remains of several other victims at Gilgo Beach. That discovery transformed a missing person case into one of America's most disturbing serial murder investigations. This episode is not about sensationalism. It is about uncertainty. Every criminal investigation leaves behind facts, assumptions, fading memories, and unanswered questions. Shannan Gilbert's case refuses to fit a single explanation. Was she suffering a psychological crisis, escaping a real threat, or targeted by someone whose identity has never been proven? More than a decade later, those questions still remain unanswered. Before we begin, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime stories that focus on criminal psychology rather than speculation, take a moment to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts after listening to the entire case. Some mysteries deserve patience instead of quick conclusions, and your perspective often adds another valuable layer to the discussion. Now let us return to that quiet spring night on Long Island where almost every answer seems to dissolve into uncertainty. Oak Beach was unlike most New York neighborhoods. Hidden behind narrow roads and surrounded by marshland, it was an isolated waterfront community of expensive vacation homes. By day, it offered quiet coastal beauty. At night, empty streets, restless winds, and deep darkness transformed the area into a place where isolation felt unsettling, and every shadow seemed more intimidating. Oak Beach's geography would later become a crucial part of the investigation. Peaceful during daylight, the neighborhood was bordered by winding roads and vast wetlands that became confusing after dark. Visibility dropped quickly, and anyone unfamiliar with the marshes could easily lose direction. The environment itself would later complicate investigators' efforts to understand Shannan's final movements. As detectives reconstructed Shannan Gilbert's last known hours, they discovered that the landscape resisted certainty. Distances looked shorter on maps than they felt on foot. Thick marsh grass concealed deep mud and uneven ground, while sound carried unpredictably across the water. These natural conditions complicated the timeline and fueled lasting debate over exactly how Shannan died. High-profile investigations often reduce victims to a single label, but doing so erases their humanity. Shannan Gilbert was 24 years old, raised in New Jersey, and determined to build a better future. Friends described her as intelligent and resilient, carrying responsibilities beyond her age, while working hard to support both herself and her family. Shannan worked as an escort, a fact that often overshadowed every other part of her life. Cases involving sex workers have historically faced delayed attention and public judgment. Yet criminologists recognize that vulnerability never reduces a person's value. In fact, offenders often target marginalized victims because they believe society will respond more slowly or care less. Her family painted a far more personal picture than newspaper headlines ever could. They remembered a daughter and sister who maintained close relationships with those she loved. She cared deeply about supporting her mother and younger sisters. She talked about building stability and eventually leaving behind the uncertainty that surrounded her work. Those dreams were ordinary, almost painfully ordinary. They reflected the same hopes shared by millions of young adults trying to create safer, more predictable lives despite financial hardship. One aspect of Shannan Gilbert's history deserves careful attention because it remains central to this case. Medical records and family statements indicate she had experienced mental health challenges, including symptoms associated with bipolar disorder. However, investigators caution against simple conclusions. A psychiatric history does not automatically invalidate someone's fear, nor does it prove that every perceived threat was imagined. The final people known to have interacted with Shannan would eventually find themselves under intense public scrutiny. Michael Pack, the driver who regularly transported her to appointments, became one of the last individuals to see her before she disappeared. His role extended beyond driving. He also served as a form of personal security, waiting nearby while clients met with her. Because of that arrangement, every decision he made during those early morning hours would later be analyzed repeatedly by investigators, journalists, and the public alike. Joseph Brewer was the client Shannan visited that night at his home in Oak Beach. The appointment appeared routine, and investigators found no immediate signs that anything unusual had happened inside the house. Yet something changed before dawn. Whether the trigger came from an external threat or Shannan's own perception remains unknown. Brewer denied harming her and was never charged. Another key witness entered the story simply by opening his front door. Oak Beach resident Gus Coletti later reported seeing Shannan in a state of obvious panic as she sought help. His account became one of the few first-hand descriptions of her after she left Brewer's house. However, investigators recognized that fear, darkness, and stress can influence even the most honest witness's memory. As more neighbors shared what they remembered, detectives noticed subtle differences between their accounts. No witness had seen the entire sequence of events, only isolated moments from a confusing night. Some details supported one another, while others conflicted. Instead of revealing a clear timeline, the testimonies highlighted how uncertainty, not certainty, became the defining feature of the investigation. Looking back, Oak Beach almost became a character in the story itself. Its quiet streets, isolated homes, and surrounding marshland created an environment where fear could easily intensify and evidence could quickly disappear. What happened there before sunrise remains uncertain, but Shannan Gilbert's final known movements transformed that peaceful community into one of America's most enduring true crime mysteries. The timeline you're about to hear has been reconstructed from witness statements, police reports, publicly released portions of the 911 call, and later investigative findings. Even so, important gaps remain. In criminal investigations, missing minutes often become the most significant clues. Shannan Gilbert's final hours reveal how fear, isolation, and uncertainty can quickly transform an ordinary night into an enduring mystery. On the evening of April 30th, 2010, Shannan Gilbert traveled from New Jersey to Oak Beach with her driver, Michael Pack, for a scheduled appointment with Joseph Brewer. By every available account, the trip appeared routine. Neither Pack nor Brewer later described anything unusual before Shannan entered the house. If danger was already present, it remained invisible to everyone around her. Investigators believe Shannan spent nearly an hour inside Brewer's home before events changed dramatically. Public records contain no evidence of a violent confrontation during that time, and Brewer consistently denied that anything threatening occurred. Yet shortly after 4 o'clock that morning, something happened that completely altered Shannan's behavior, creating questions that investigators still cannot fully answer. At approximately 4:51 a.m., Shannan placed a 911 call that lasted about 23 minutes. Throughout the recording, she repeatedly insisted that someone was trying to kill her. However, she never clearly identified who that person was. Her voice reflected unmistakable fear, but her statements offered investigators no clear explanation of what or who had triggered such overwhelming panic. Behavioral psychologists caution against interpreting emergency calls from only one perspective. Under extreme stress, people often speak in fragmented thoughts, lose track of time, or struggle to identify those around them. Yet these same behaviors can also occur when someone faces genuine danger. For investigators, the greatest challenge was determining whether Shannan's fear reflected psychological distress, an external threat, or both. One of the most debated details is Shannan's repeated refusal to leave with Michael Pack. Investigative records indicate that Pack repeatedly urged her to return to his vehicle, but she consistently refused. Fear can rapidly alter perception, causing even trusted individuals to seem threatening. Whether her decision reflected impaired judgment or a rational survival response remains impossible to determine with certainty. After leaving Joseph Brewer's home, Shannan ran through the quiet streets of Oak Beach instead of heading toward the community exit. She knocked on several doors seeking help before suddenly fleeing again. To witnesses, her movements appeared confused. To someone convinced they were being pursued, however, changing direction repeatedly could also represent an attempt to avoid an unseen threat while searching for safety. One of the most important witnesses that morning was Gus Coletti, a longtime Oak Beach resident. He later described seeing Shannan Gilbert frightened, confused, and desperately seeking help outside his home. Because he had no known connection to her, his observations became crucial. Before police or neighbors could offer meaningful assistance, Shannan suddenly ran back into the darkness. Coletti's account has been interpreted in very different ways. Those supporting the accidental death theory believe he witnessed someone in the middle of a severe psychological crisis. Others argue that the intensity of Shannan's fear suggests she was fleeing a genuine threat. Coletti could only describe what he saw. He could not explain what had frightened her so profoundly. After Shannan disappeared from Coletti's property, no verified witness ever saw her alive again. No surveillance cameras captured her final movements, and investigators found no evidence showing the exact route she took through the marshland. From that moment forward, detectives could reconstruct events only by combining witness accounts, physical evidence, and careful investigative analysis. As daylight arrived, Shannan failed to contact anyone, an unusual break from her normal routine. Concern quickly grew among family members who reported her missing. Search efforts initially focused on finding a vulnerable young woman believed to be lost somewhere around Oak Beach. No one realized the investigation would soon uncover something far more disturbing than a single disappearance. Search teams combed roads, nearby homes, wooded areas, and the surrounding marshes with limited information. The difficult landscape complicated every effort. Thick vegetation reduced visibility, wetlands slowed movement, and changing tides gradually erased fragile evidence. With every passing day, nature quietly altered the scene, making it increasingly difficult for investigators to preserve clues or reconstruct Shannan's final path. Months later, the search expanded toward Gilgo Beach, where investigators made a shocking discovery. Human remains belonging to multiple victims were found along Ocean Parkway, transforming a missing person investigation into a major serial homicide case. Although many immediately assumed Shannan's death was connected, detectives emphasized that geographic proximity alone could never establish a direct forensic link. As the investigation continued, attention focused on the people who had spent Shannan's final known hours with her. Michael Pack, her driver and informal security escort, faced repeated questioning as investigators compared his statements over time. Although minor inconsistencies appeared, detectives understood that memory often changes after traumatic events, making every detail worthy of careful examination rather than immediate suspicion. Joseph Brewer also remained under close scrutiny because he was the last client known to have seen Shannan before she disappeared. Detectives thoroughly investigated his account and examined the available evidence. Despite years of speculation, authorities never found sufficient forensic proof to charge him. Throughout the case, investigators were repeatedly reminded that suspicion alone can never replace legally admissible evidence. Residents of Oak Beach added more pieces to the puzzle, but their memories rarely matched perfectly. Some recalled seeing Shannan running through the neighborhood, while others reported hearing voices or noticing unusual activity before sunrise. These conflicting accounts highlighted a well-known principle in criminal psychology. Memory is reconstructive, meaning honest witnesses can remember the same event in different ways. Nearly 19 months later, in December 2011, search teams discovered Shannan's skeletal remains in marshland close to where she had last been seen alive. The discovery confirmed that she had never left Oak Beach, yet it answered only one question while raising many others. The condition of the remains prevented investigators from reaching an immediate consensus about how she had died. The discovery site soon became a major source of controversy. Many questioned how Shannan's remains had been missed during earlier searches. Investigators explained that wetlands can easily conceal evidence because of dense marsh grass, flooding, and changing terrain. The initial forensic examination found no definitive cause of death, leaving the case open to competing interpretations. Finding a body rarely ends a criminal investigation. Instead, it often creates even more questions than answers. While the discovery confirms that a tragedy occurred, it does not automatically reveal how or why it happened. In Shannan Gilbert's case, the recovery of her remains expanded the mystery, forcing investigators to reconsider every theory against incomplete and often inconclusive forensic evidence. The marshland where Shannan was found presented enormous challenges for forensic investigators. Unlike an indoor crime scene, wetlands constantly change as tides shift, vegetation grows, and wildlife alters the landscape. Over time, valuable evidence can disappear naturally. Detectives understood that the environment itself may have erased clues capable of explaining exactly what happened during Shannan's final hours. Investigators carefully collected every piece of recoverable evidence, including skeletal remains, clothing, personal belongings, and environmental samples. Yet the forensic findings proved frustratingly inconclusive. No injuries clearly established homicide, but neither did the evidence confirm an accidental death. Instead, investigators were left with a case that supported multiple possibilities while providing certainty for none of them. One principle guided the investigation throughout the years. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Detectives recognized that environmental exposure could have destroyed signs of violence, while prosecutors required proof beyond reasonable doubt before treating the case as homicide. This conflict between scientific uncertainty and legal standards became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. As the investigation continued, national media focused on an extraordinary development. The search for Shannan unexpectedly led police to multiple homicide victims hidden near Gilgo Beach, transforming a missing person investigation into the wider Long Island serial killer case. Overnight, Shannan became known not only for her own disappearance, but also for exposing one of America's most disturbing criminal investigations. Media coverage kept the case alive while heavily shaping public perception. News reports, documentaries, and internet discussions fueled countless theories, many constructed on limited factual evidence. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as confirmation bias, where people selectively favor information that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs. In Shannan Gilbert's case, public narratives and widespread speculation often developed far faster than law enforcement could officially verify the actual facts, illustrating how intense media exposure can easily cloud objective reality. For Shannan's family, the attention came at a painful cost. They repeatedly challenged the conclusion that her death was accidental and requested independent forensic reviews. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the actions of Michael Pack, comparing his statements over several interviews. Although some inconsistencies emerged, detectives also recognized that memory naturally changes after stressful and traumatic experiences. Behavioral analysts distinguish between inconsistency and deception. A dishonest witness may deliberately change details to protect a false story, while a truthful witness often recalls events differently after trauma. Investigators therefore rely on corroborating evidence rather than intuition alone. In Michael Pack's case, detectives found reasons for continued scrutiny but never obtained forensic evidence proving criminal responsibility. Joseph Brewer also remained under intense public suspicion because he was the last client known to see Shannan alive inside his home. Detectives searched his property, reviewed available evidence, and questioned him extensively. Despite years of speculation, authorities found no physical evidence connecting him to Shannan's death. The gap between public suspicion and legal proof remained one of the investigation's greatest frustrations. Some investigators and members of the public considered another possibility, that someone else in Oak Beach became involved after Shannan fled the neighborhood. Several residents reported hearing unusual sounds or noticing suspicious activity before sunrise. However, fragmented observations rarely produce reliable conclusions. Criminal investigations often show that sincere witnesses remember traumatic events differently, making reconstruction increasingly difficult over time. Detectives focused on understanding Shannan's complete background rather than solely hunting suspects. They thoroughly reviewed her work history, medical records, personal finances, relationships, and daily routines. In victimology, this standard practice analyzes a victim's unique life circumstances to reveal potential hidden risks without placing any blame. Ultimately, the primary goal of this comprehensive investigative approach is to objectively explain the tragic events rather than passing judgment on individual personal choices. Shannan's work as an escort naturally brought her into contact with unfamiliar people, increasing opportunities for dangerous encounters. Criminologists describe this as exposure risk rather than direct causation. Most appointments involving escorts end safely. However, offenders sometimes target vulnerable individuals whom they believe may receive slower attention from authorities or less public sympathy after they disappear. Investigators also examined Shannan's documented mental health history, including reports of symptoms associated with bipolar disorder. Forensic psychologists caution against allowing psychiatric history to dominate an investigation. A diagnosis describes vulnerability, not certainty. Mental illness does not prevent someone from recognizing genuine danger, nor should it become a convenient explanation for every unexplained event. Shannan's family strongly believed her mental health history had received too much emphasis. They acknowledged her past struggles, but argued that she remained capable of making rational decisions. They insisted her repeated statements during the 911 call that someone was trying to kill her deserved greater investigative weight than assumptions based solely on her psychiatric background. In 2016, Suffolk County Medical Examiner Dr. Richard Dormer concluded that the evidence most strongly supported accidental death after Shannan entered the marsh in a state of panic. However, an independent expert hired by her family questioned that conclusion, citing possible abnormalities in neck structures that could suggest strangulation. The conflicting opinions highlighted an enduring reality of forensic science. When evidence is incomplete, uncertainty often remains impossible to eliminate. As investigations enter a second decade, subtle changes inevitably occur. Detectives retire, witness memories fade, and physical evidence ages. Yet, unresolved cases like Shannan Gilbert's refuse to disappear, continually evolving alongside emerging forensic technology and psychological perspectives. Her case endures precisely because no single explanation has managed to answer every critical question without leaving significant analytical gaps behind. When evaluating unresolved cases, experienced profilers avoid asking which theory feels most convincing. Instead, they examine which explanation requires the fewest unsupported assumptions while remaining consistent with proven evidence. In Shannan's case, two primary theories dominate serious discussion. Each is supported by credible arguments, yet both continue to face substantial limitations that investigators have never fully eliminated. The first theory concludes that Shannan died following an episode of overwhelming psychological distress. According to this interpretation, something inside Brewer's residence triggered an intense state of panic. Whether that panic resulted from a psychiatric episode, substance-related impairment, overwhelming fear, or a combination of several factors remains uncertain. Once she fled into the darkness, her judgment may have deteriorated further, as exhaustion, confusion, and the unfamiliar environment combined to produce increasingly irrational decisions. Supporters of this explanation point towards several pieces of evidence. Shannan repeatedly refused assistance from individuals who, based on available evidence, may have been attempting to help her leave safely. Her movements through Oak Beach appeared disorganized rather than purposeful. The marshland surrounding the community is notoriously dangerous at night, particularly for someone unfamiliar with its terrain. Official forensic findings concluded that no definitive evidence established homicide. From this perspective, the tragedy resulted not from an attacker, but from the devastating consequences of fear colliding with an unforgiving environment. Behaviorally, this theory aligns with survival behavior under extreme cognitive overload. During acute panic, the brain's threat detection systems overwhelm rational planning, leading individuals toward danger while attempting escape. Decision-making appears incomprehensible afterward, yet this reflects an overwhelmed nervous system prioritizing immediate survival over careful analysis. Though accidental death explains forensic details, it struggles to clarify the intense, consistent fear Shannan expressed during her call. The second theory posits that Shannan was fleeing a genuine, unidentified external threat. Proponents argue her extreme fear was a rational response rather than psychological instability. She may have encountered someone whose intentions terrified her after leaving the residence. From this perspective, her chaotic, unpredictable movements represented a desperate attempt to survive real danger, with the marsh becoming the tragic final destination of her escape. This theory gained traction after searches for Shannan unexpectedly uncovered the remains of multiple homicide victims along Gilgo Beach. The proximity between her disappearance and a serial killer's dumping ground naturally led observers to suspect a connection. Human nature instinctively seeks patterns when tragedies overlap geographically. However, while pattern recognition fuels speculation, investigators emphasize that geographic closeness alone does not constitute definitive proof. Years later, the Gilgo Beach investigation advanced significantly with the arrest of architect Rex Heuermann for several Ocean Parkway homicides. Nevertheless, authorities have not charged Heuermann in Shannan Gilbert's death, nor published forensic evidence linking him to her case. Distinguishing legally confirmed facts from popular public speculation remains crucial for maintaining the integrity of both ongoing investigations and honoring the truth. From a psychological perspective, fear is neither completely rational nor irrational. It combines external threats with internal emotional states. A real threat amplifies psychological vulnerability, while mental distress magnifies ordinary situations. Whether Shannan fled a genuine pursuer or suffered an acute crisis, both scenarios produce remarkably similar outward behavior, explaining why criminal psychologists still debate her case today. Popular culture portrays violent criminals, leaving obvious clues, but experienced investigators know dangerous offenders often exploit confusion, uncertainty, and fragmented memories. If someone was involved in Shannan's death, their greatest advantage was slipping away amid an already chaotic situation. Meanwhile, investigators must avoid narrative completion, the cognitive trap of forcing incomplete evidence into a comfortable, convenient story. Reopening this investigation with advanced modern methods could yield vital breakthroughs. Enhanced digital reconstruction could map telecommunications and movements to create a precise timeline. Modern forensic techniques might recover previously undetectable biological material from preserved evidence. Additionally, behavioral analysts can reevaluate witness statements to identify stress-related recall and memory contamination without automatically assuming any deliberate deception. Perhaps the greatest lesson extends far beyond forensic science itself. Shannan Gilbert reminds society how easily victims are categorized using simplistic labels, where occupation becomes identity and diagnosis becomes explanation. Every victim is a complete human being with complex vulnerabilities. When prejudice replaces curiosity, justice becomes far more difficult, proving that true understanding requires rejecting reductive stereotypes. The Gilgo Beach investigation continues evolving, yet Shannan's case remains unique and unresolved. Some investigators support an accidental death theory, while others believe critical questions linger. This profound uncertainty deeply impacts her family, representing the painful difference between accepting a tragic accident and believing unacknowledged violence occurred, an emotional burden that endures far longer than court proceedings. Unresolved cases inflict what grief researchers call ambiguous loss, preventing families from fully processing tragedy. Questions replace conclusions, and hope competes with facts, making ambiguity more exhausting than certainty. Ultimately, fear shaped Shannan's every final decision, where she ran and whom she trusted. Understanding her fear reveals the powerful impact psychological states exert when individuals face isolated danger. Over 15 years later, the original questions surrounding Oak Beach remain virtually unchanged. What terrified Shannan so completely, and why do facts resist a single uncontested truth? Perhaps missing answers await future technology. Until then, our shared responsibility is to separate fact from assumption, empathy from prejudice, and evidence from unearned certainty, the fundamental discipline required for genuine justice. Some crimes are solved by fingerprints, DNA, or forgotten memories. Others, like Shannan Gilbert's, leave only silence as the final witness. Her story may never yield every answer, yet it constantly reminds investigators, psychologists, and the public that the most dangerous mysteries hide within profound uncertainty rather than darkness. Ultimately, some crimes leave no screams, only persistent questions, and some silences echo far louder than any actual confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.